We're going to talk a little bit about the effects of writer's craft on meaning in a text. One of the highlights of OEU 4, fourth quarter English 11, is that we focus on writer's craft. What does a writer do to communicate the message? And so this is one of the early steps in looking at what writers do. We look at what other writers do so that when it comes time for us to write our personal essays, we kind of have an idea of what it is that writers do to convey message. And then we can use some of those same tricks and techniques in our own writing. So writer's craft. Writer's craft includes all the tools and techniques a writer uses to communicate meaning. And the list is probably slightly bigger than this, but this is all we really need to worry about for us and for our purposes. So these tools include perspective. Is this first person? Is this third person? Is it second person? We look at tone, voice, mood. Tone is the attitude or feeling of a text. Voice is coming from the author. Figurative language, that's going to include all kinds of things like imagery, simile, metaphor, hyperbole, which is exaggeration, understatement, overstatement, repetition. So those kinds of tools that help readers show us a story. Details and setting, and that includes more than just place, but it can also include time. We look at description, particularly the detailed description, and then dialogue, words that people say rather than he told me to go to town. Put it in quotations. John said, quote, go to town, end quote. Dialogue has a way of quickening the pace of a text. Dialogue brings readers into a text, makes it more real, makes it active as opposed to passive. And then syntax is a technique that writers use to communicate meaning. And syntax might be a term that you are unfamiliar with. And so I've defined syntax over here. Syntax includes word choice. Another term for word choice is diction. Syntax also includes the organization of words in a sentence. How is the sentence put together? Are you using a dependent clause, independent clause? Are you using simple sentences? Are you using complex sentences? Syntax also looks at how the sentences are organized in a paragraph, and syntax also looks at how those paragraphs are organized into a text. These are all elements of writer's craft, and these are some of the details that we're going to be looking at. In this slideshow, we'll be looking at the Zora Neale Hurston essay, which you've already read, and then I'll have another screencast for you that looks at a second text and walks through it. So Zora Neale Hurston, what does she do in her text to bring her message to life? And remember, her text was called How It Feels to Be Color to Me. She wrote it in the 1920s in the jazz era. And so we're going to just kind of look at some of the sentences in her text. So the first one we're going to look at is out of paragraph 6, starting at line 40. The questions are, what words or phrases jump out at you, and what images does Hurston use to communicate her ideas? And so here is paragraph 6 for you. I skipped the first line to save space on the slide, and the first sentence read, but changes came in the family when I was 13 and I was sent to school in Jacksonville. I left Eatonville, the town of Oleanders, as Zora. When I disembarked from the riverboat at Jacksonville, she was no more. It seemed that I had suffered a sea change. I was not Zora of Orange County anymore. I was now a little colored girl. I found it out in certain ways. In my heart, as well as in the mirror, I became a fast brown, warranted not to rub or run. I've highlighted some of her phrases here just to kind of get us started. She's talking about her town, the town of Oleanders, and how when she left her town, she was Zora, just Zora. When she got off the boat in Jacksonville, she says, I had suffered a sea change. This idea of a sea change is a phraseology that we don't hear a lot anymore, but typically a sea change means a massive change took place at a fundamental level. So if you hear anybody say, oh, that highlighted the sea change, or that was the sea change, or I underwent a sea change, they're talking about a change at a fundamental, basic, primary level. And so she gets off the boat, and she's no longer just Zora, the cute little girl in her town. Now she's a little colored girl. And keep in mind that in the 1920s, they would have used the term colored. That was the politically correct term. Today we would say a person of color or Black American. But she got off, she was a colored girl. And with that, in Jacksonville came all of the Jim Crow regulations of separate bathrooms, separate seats on the bus, separate entrances, separate schools, all that segregation, Jim Crow stuff that she never experienced in Eatonville, because Eatonville was a town of all Black Americans. And so now she's, for the first time at age 13, figuring out what does it mean to be Black American. And then she says that in my heart, as well as in the mirror, so she knew it in her inner self as well as being able to see it, I became a fast brown, warranted not to rub or run. Fast brown means like a permanent dye. So if something's fast, color fast, it means that it's not going to run, it's not going to fade, it's not going to rub off. It means it's permanent and it's fixed. And so she's showing how she went from just being Zora to now carrying with her everything that it means to be a little colored girl living in the South. So we've got this image of the sea change. We've got this imagery of a permanently dyed color. And both of those things help to express her understanding of what it means to be a Black woman in America. Throughout her essay, she also uses figurative language, imagery in particular, through the use of metaphors and similes. I've already talked about her use of the metaphor fast brown being that permanent color that won't come off or change. In paragraph 7, she talks about she's busy sharpening her oyster knife. And that's an allusion to that phrase that life is an oyster, right? And so an oyster might be crusty and crunchy on the outside, but you use that knife and you tear it open, and on the inside is this soft flesh to eat, and if you're lucky, there might even be a pearl. And so oysters are also looked at as an aphrodisiac. They're looked at as expensive, fancy food. And so she's talking about how her life is something fantastic, and she's going to get her oyster knife sharpened and dig in and see what there is to experience. In paragraph 8, she talks about slavery, and she says people are always like, oh yeah, you're the granddaughter of a slave, remember? And she's like, yeah, I know that, thank you. But she talks about how slavery for her was 60 years in the past. So this is the 1920s. Slavery ended in 1865. And she says, the operation was successful and the patient is doing well, thank you. And so she's trying to say there, through that metaphor of an operation, that allusion, she's alluding to the image of an operation, that, yeah, it was painful and it was a hard experience, but we're healing, we're over that, let's move on. And then in paragraph 8 also, she talks about that race, ready, set, go. And so life is a race, right? We run that race of life and try to finish successfully. She also uses figurative language when she shares her experience of jazz music. There are so many descriptive parts in this jazz music paragraph, in paragraph 12. She talks about the bright colors, the music that constricts the thorax and splits the heart, and the harmonies are narcotic, and the orchestra is rambunctious and rears on its hind legs, and it's a primitive fury of this music. And within her soul, she's dancing wildly, yelling, whooping. She's shaking a ceremonial sword above her head. She's screeching. She feels, very primitive and primal, and her pulse is throbbing like a war drum. And all of that is this figurative, descriptive language of how powerful the music is for her. And then at the end, she talks about the brown bag of a miscellany that's propped up against a wall with a whole bunch of other bags of other colors. And that is a metaphor for people. Every person is a bag of one type or another filled with miscellany. And so when we encounter these images, we need to spend some time to think about them and to ponder, how do these images add to or expand on the meaning of her ideas? All of these things just deepen her exploration of what it means to be Zora, and her experience of life in the U.S. in the 1920s at the height of the jazz era. She also uses dialogue, but not very much of it. You'll see that there's very little use throughout the whole text. In paragraph 4, she's talking. She says, I'd wave at them, and when they return my salute, I would say something like this: how do you do? Well, I thank you, where you going? And this dialogue, written in the way she would have said it, all smushed together into one sentence, is just a way for her to share with us how precocious she was as a child and how curious she was about the tourists driving through town. In paragraph 7, there's that whole running the race metaphor on the line, get set, go. And it's not so much what they are saying that I think is important in this set of dialogue, as much as it is who is saying it, right? The terrible struggle that made me an American out of a potential slave said on the line. So we look at history, right? The end of slavery set her up to say, are you ready? The Reconstruction said, get set. And so this is that opportunity at the end of the Civil War for Black Americans to own their own land, to get educated, to move forward in life, and to move up in life. And then the generation before, this is the generation before Zora, so her parents, her grandparents, they said go. And then she's like, I'm off flying. So we've got a little bit of dialogue there. In paragraph 13 is the only other time that we see dialogue, and this is where her white friend is commenting on jazz. And he says, good music they have here, he remarks, drumming the table with his fingers. And then this narration that comes after what he says, I think is the really cool contrast with what he says. He says, good music they have here. And her narration, which is right here, music. The great blobs of purple and red emotion have not touched him. He has only heard what I felt. And so this piece of dialogue is setting up that contrast between what this white friend hears, feels, and thinks about the jazz music that they're both listening to at the same time together, and how that music affected her. And so when you encounter dialogue in a personal essay, it's important to look at, well, what is the purpose? And then we look at tone. Tone is the general character attitude of a text. You have to look at the adjectives that she uses and adverbs. She says, I am not tragically colored. No great sorrow dammed up in my soul. These are words that look at sadness and depressing ideas, but she doesn't have them. She talks about sauntering, feeling snooty, the cosmic Zora, rising above. And so you look